Clutching the deed to a dilapidated Victorian mansion, his last desperate gamble from a surprising inheritance, Ethan Caldwell turns his back on 3 generations of family farming to chase a fool's dream in a forgotten corner of Oregon. What begins as a reckless attempt to start over leads him to a dust-covered trapdoor in the mansion's forgotten library. What he doesn't realize is that the artifacts hidden beneath the floorboards aren't just valuable antiques. They're the long-lost collection of renowned archaeologist Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. As local museum curator Sophia Reeves helps authenticate his discovery, Ethan finds himself torn between instant wealth and revealing a historical truth that could rewrite history, but might cost him everything he's rebuilding. This unforgettable story explores how true value isn't measured in ancient gold or precious stones, but in the courage to honor the past while embracing an unexpected future. Before we dive deeper, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extraordinary for you. The morning heat settled over Caldwell Acres like a weighted blanket, suffocating what little remained of Ethan's wheat crop. He walked the perimeter of his eastern field, boots kicking up dust where irrigation had failed months ago. 3 years of drought had worn grooves into his face that matched the parched cracks in the soil beneath him. At 36, Ethan Caldwell looked a decade older, his once broad shoulders now slightly stooped under the weight of impending failure. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had survived the Dust Bowl. His father had modernized through the farm crisis of the 80s, but it seemed Ethan would be the one to lose it all. "Not much to look at anymore, is it, Max?" he said to the aging border collie at his side. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg as if offering comfort. The bank's final notice had arrived yesterday, giving him 30 days before foreclosure. 300 acres that had once produced the county's finest wheat and barley, reduced to a worthless expanse of sun-baked clay. His last tractor had been sold in April. The remaining equipment would barely cover a quarter of his debt. Ethan pulled his worn cap lower over his eyes as he squinted toward the farmhouse in the distance. The white paint was peeling, the porch sagging slightly on one side. His mother had planted rose bushes along the front walk before cancer took her 5 years ago. They were the only things still thriving, stubborn and wild in their refusal to surrender to the elements. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention. A cloud of dust announced a visitor long before the beat-up mail truck came into view. Marjorie Canton had been delivering mail in Riverdale County for over 40 years and knew everyone's business before they did. "Morning, Ethan," she called, not bothering to step out of her vehicle. "Got something that's not a bill for once." She handed him a thick envelope with an unfamiliar return address. Blackwood and Associates, attorneys at law, Portland, Oregon. "Looks important," she noted, making no move to continue her route. "Not often we see fancy lawyer mail around here." Ethan nodded non-committally, knowing whatever he said would be dinner conversation in half the county by nightfall. Alone again, he tore open the envelope, expecting perhaps a new debt he'd forgotten. Instead, he found himself staring at a formal letter that began, "We regret to inform you of the passing of Miss Vivian Blackwood, your mother's second cousin." Ethan vaguely remembered his mother mentioning a distant relative who'd moved east decades ago. They'd never met. The letter continued, "As per the wishes expressed in her will, and as the last living descendant of the shared Caldwell Blackwood lineage, you have inherited her estate, including the property known as Blackwood Manor in Ravens Hollow, Oregon, as well as all contents therein. Attached was a property deed, photos of a once grand Victorian mansion, now clearly in disrepair, and information about accessing a modest bank account to cover transfer costs and initial taxes." Ethan sank down onto a nearby fence post, letter clutched in his trembling hand. The inheritance wasn't a fortune. The house looked like it needed more work than he could afford, but it was something, an alternative to watching his family legacy crumble into dust. That evening, the local diner buzzed with the news of Ethan's inheritance. Word traveled fast in small towns. Frank Miller, whose family had farmed neighboring land for generations, slid into the booth across from Ethan. "Heard you're headed west," Frank said, signaling the waitress for coffee. "Marjorie says you inherited some fancy house." "Wouldn't call it fancy," Ethan replied, sliding the photos across the table. "More like a project." Frank whistled low. "That's one way of putting it. You really leaving all this behind?" Ethan looked out the window at all this. A dying town, failed crops, crushing debt. "Not much to leave, Frank." "Your daddy would have stayed and fought," Frank said, the words cutting deeper than he knew. "My daddy didn't face 3 years of drought and a bank ready to take everything," Ethan countered. "Sometimes fighting means knowing when to change battlefields." Later that night, as Ethan packed what little he planned to take, his phone rang. It was Liam Peterson from the bank. "Ethan, heard the news. That inheritance change anything about our timeline?" "I'm not asking for extensions, Liam. You'll get your foreclosure papers signed before I leave." "That's not why I called," Liam said, his voice softer. "My father gave your father chances when times were tough. I wish I could do the same. But corporate has me tied." "I know," Ethan said. "No hard feelings." "That house, you sure it's worth starting over? Reports say Raven's Hollow's been dying since the lumber mill closed." "At least they have rain," Ethan replied. 1 week later, with Max riding shotgun and his life packed into his truck, Ethan handed the farm keys to Liam outside the bank. 3 generations of Caldwell history surrendered in a single moment. "There's a maintenance account for the family cemetery," Ethan said. "Make sure whoever buys the place knows it's not part of the deal." Liam nodded solemnly. "Your great-grandmother's roses. Take cuttings if you want," Ethan interrupted. "They're survivors." He drove away without looking back, the dust from his family's land settling on his truck one last time. 2 days later, Ethan stood in the overgrown driveway of Blackwood Manor, Max sitting patiently beside his dusty pickup. The Victorian mansion loomed before them, 3 stories of faded grandeur with a wraparound porch and intricate gingerbread trim. Shutters hung at odd angles, paint peeled in long strips, and several windows were boarded over. But beneath the decay, Ethan could see the bones of something magnificent, something that, like him, had refused to collapse despite years of neglect. "Well, Max," he said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears, "I guess we're home." What Ethan couldn't know as he climbed the creaking steps to the front door, key in hand, was that beneath this crumbling mansion lay secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about value, history, and his own unexpected place. In a story that began long before he was born, as he turned the key in the rusted lock, the door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo his own uncertainty. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the grime-covered windows, illuminating a grand entryway frozen in time. And somewhere beneath his feet, hidden in darkness, waited a collection of artifacts that would change not just his future, but history itself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 hours before Ethan Caldwell turned his key in the lock of Blackwood Manor, Dr. Sophia Reeves sat in her cramped office at the Ravens Hollow Historical Society and Museum, surrounded by stacks of grant applications and budget spreadsheets. At 34, she was the youngest museum curator in the county's history. Not that there was much competition for the position in a town that most young professionals fled at the first opportunity. The afternoon light filtered through dusty blinds, illuminating the controlled chaos of her workspace. Display cases waited to be repaired, artifact catalogues needed updating, and the persistent leak in the ceiling had left a rust-colored stain on the vintage tile floor. The town council had cut the museum's budget again, claiming that preserving history was a luxury Ravenshollow could no longer afford. Sophia tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and adjusted her glasses, focusing on the letter she was drafting to a potential donor. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she searched for the right words to convey urgency without desperation. Dr. Reeves. Her assistant Miguel appeared in the doorway. At 19, he was the only volunteer who showed up consistently, his passion for local history matching her own. The council called. They're moving up the vote on the museum's funding to next week. Sophia's stomach tightened. They promised us 30 days to develop a new proposal. Miguel shrugged apologetically. Mayor Wilson says the town needs to address fiscal realities. Fiscal realities, Sophia repeated bitterly, as if our history isn't real enough to matter. She turned to the wall behind her desk, where a large photograph hung in a simple frame. It showed a striking woman in her 40s standing before an archaeological dig, her expression confident and determined. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, one of the most promising archaeologists of her generation, had disappeared during an expedition in 1976, leaving behind a legacy of groundbreaking discoveries and unanswered questions. Eleanor had been born in Ravenshollow, and her family's mansion had once been the crown jewel of the town. After her disappearance, the estate had fallen into disrepair, becoming a tangible reminder of how quickly glory could fade to ruin. For Sophia, Eleanor Blackwood represented everything she aspired to be: brilliant, fearless, unwilling to compromise when it came to preserving historical truth. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now fought the same battles Eleanor had, trying to convince pragmatic minds of the value in things long buried. I heard Blackwood Manor finally sold, Miguel said, following her gaze to the photograph. Some farmer from Eastern Oregon bought it. Sophia's attention snapped back. Sold? When? Deed transferred last week. My mom handles the paperwork at the county office. Miguel leaned against the doorframe. Guy's name is Caldwell. Apparently he's some distant relative of the Blackwoods. A relative. Sophia felt a flutter of both excitement and apprehension. For years, she had tried to gain access to Blackwood Manor, convinced that Eleanor's personal papers and research notes must still be somewhere inside. The previous caretaker, a lawyer representing the estate, had consistently denied her requests, citing privacy concerns. Did your mother say anything else about him? Miguel shook his head. Just that he paid the back taxes in full. Looks like he's planning to stay. After Miguel left, Sophia pulled open her bottom desk drawer and removed a worn leather journal, her personal research on Eleanor Blackwood. Unlike the official narrative that Eleanor had simply gotten lost during her final expedition, Sophia had pieced together evidence suggesting something far more intriguing. Eleanor's last correspondence, sent just days before her disappearance, had mentioned a discovery that will rewrite history, and her intention to bring the truth home where it belongs. No significant artifacts from that expedition had ever been catalogued in any museum or university collection, leading Sophia to theorize that Eleanor might have secretly transported her findings back to Ravenshollow before she vanished. If she was right, somewhere in Blackwood Manor lay answers to questions that had haunted the archaeological community for decades. And now, a stranger with no knowledge of that history held the keys. Sophia closed the journal and made a decision. She would meet this Ethan Caldwell as soon as possible, before he had a chance to unwittingly discard what might be priceless historical evidence. What Sophia couldn't know as she gathered her research was that her academic interest in Blackwood Manor was about to collide with a personal journey she never expected to take, one that would challenge her concepts of value, truth, and what it meant to preserve the past while building a future. The path that had led Sophia to Raven's Hollow was far from direct. The daughter of prominent Boston academics, she had been groomed for an Ivy League career from childhood. Her undergraduate work at Harvard had been followed by a PhD program at Columbia, where she specialized in North American archaeological history. Her dissertation on forgotten female pioneers in early American archaeology had focused heavily on Eleanor Blackwood, whose revolutionary techniques and discoveries had been largely overlooked by a field dominated by men. What had begun as academic interest evolved into something approaching obsession as Sophia uncovered inconsistencies in the official account of Eleanor's disappearance. 3 years ago, against the advice of her mentors and the bewilderment of her parents, Sophia had turned down a prestigious position at the University of Chicago to accept the curatorship in Raven's Hollow. Her colleagues had been baffled. Why would a rising star in archaeological academia bury herself in a dying timber town with a museum housed in a converted library? What she couldn't explain to their satisfaction was the pull she felt toward Eleanor's story, the conviction that something significant remained undiscovered. In her small apartment above the local bookstore, Sophia kept a map marked with every location connected to Eleanor's life and work. At the center was Blackwood Manor, the one place she hadn't been able to access until now. That evening, as she drove her aging Subaru along the winding road that led to the Blackwood estate, Sophia rehearsed her introduction. She would be professional but approachable, informative without being overwhelming. She would explain the historical significance of the property without implying that its new owner was somehow unqualified to steward it. The road narrowed as it climbed into the foothills, tall pines creating shadows that deepened in the late afternoon light. Blackwood Manor had been built by Eleanor's grandfather, a lumber baron who had once owned half the forests surrounding Raven's Hollow. Its isolated location had been chosen for the panoramic views of the valley, though now those views were largely obscured by trees that had grown unchecked for decades. As the mansion came into view around the final bend, Sophia slowed her car, taking in the sight. Despite its dilapidated state, Blackwood Manor retained a certain grandeur, a testament to craftsmanship that modern buildings rarely achieved. The Victorian architecture, with its asymmetrical facades and decorative woodwork, created a silhouette against the sky that was both imposing and somehow vulnerable. A dusty pickup truck with Eastern Oregon plates was parked in the circular driveway, confirming that the new owner had indeed arrived. Beside it stood a man and a border collie, both regarding the mansion with what appeared to be equal measures of determination and uncertainty. Sophia parked behind the truck and took a deep breath. First impressions mattered, especially when you were about to tell someone that their new home might contain historically significant artifacts they had no legal obligation to preserve or report. As she stepped out of her car, the border collie noticed her first, barking once before trotting over to investigate. The man turned, and Sophia had her first clear view of Ethan Caldwell. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the leathery tan of someone who worked outdoors, he looked out of place against the backdrop of Victorian opulence, even one as faded as Blackwood Manor. "Can I help you?" His voice carried easily across the driveway. Polite but cautious, Sophia approached with her most professional smile, hand extended. "Mr. Caldwell? I'm Dr. Sophia Reeves from the Raven's Hollow Historical Society and Museum. I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard you'd taken ownership of the manor, and I wanted to welcome you to the area." Ethan's handshake was firm, his hands calloused in a way that spoke of years of physical labor. Up close, Sophia could see the fatigue etched around his eyes and the wariness with which he regarded her. This was a man who had learned to expect complications rather than assistance. News travels fast, he observed. Small town, Sophia acknowledged, especially when it concerns Blackwood Manor. This property has significant historical importance to Ravens Hollow. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a subtle tightening around the mouth that suggested he was bracing himself. If you're here about historical preservation restrictions, I should tell you that the lawyer was clear about the property being free of encumbrances. Sophia quickly raised her hands in a placating gesture. No, nothing like that. The manor isn't on any historical registry. I'm actually here because of my research on the previous owner, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood. She was a renowned archaeologist and a personal hero of mine. The border collie had circled back to Ethan's side, pressing against his leg as if sensing his tension. Eleanor Blackwood. Ethan repeated the name slowly. The lawyer mentioned her. She was my mother's cousin, apparently, though Mom never talked much about that side of the family. Sophia felt a flutter of excitement. A family connection, however distant, might make Ethan more receptive to learning about Eleanor's work and legacy. Dr. Blackwood made groundbreaking discoveries throughout her career, Sophia explained, trying to contain her enthusiasm. Her final expedition before her disappearance in 1976 was particularly significant, though the findings were never fully documented. Ethan glanced back at the mansion, then at the setting sun. Look, Dr. Reeves. Sophia, please. Sophia, I appreciate the welcome, but I've been driving for 2 days, and I've got about an hour of daylight left to figure out if this place has running water and a roof that doesn't leak. Maybe we could continue this conversation another time. She had pushed too hard, too fast. Sophia mentally chided herself for her academic enthusiasm overriding basic social awareness. This man had just arrived at a new home in a new town after what was clearly a difficult transition. The mysteries of Eleanor Blackwood could wait a day or two. Of course, I'm sorry, she said quickly. That was inconsiderate of me. You must be exhausted. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Here's my contact information. The museum is just off Main Street if you need anything. Local recommendations, historical context for the house, or just a cup of coffee with someone who isn't a complete stranger. Ethan took the card, studying it briefly before slipping it into his shirt pocket. Thanks. I might take you up on that once. I'm settled. As Sophia turned to leave, something made her pause. Mr. Caldwell, Ethan, one small piece of advice. Blackwood Manor has been empty for a long time. If you find anything that seems historically significant or unusual, especially papers or artifacts that might have belonged to Eleanor, I'd be happy to help you identify them. No obligation, of course. Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but he nodded. I'll keep that in mind. Driving back toward town, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she had just set something significant in motion. What neither she nor Ethan could possibly know was how quickly their separate paths would converge around a discovery that had been waiting patiently beneath the floorboards of Blackwood Manor for nearly 50 years. A discovery that would challenge everything they thought they understood about value, history, and their own unexpected places in a story that had begun long before either of them was born. The first 3 days at Blackwood Manor were a harsh education in Victorian home repair. Ethan discovered that the mansion had been built with craftsmanship that no longer existed and required maintenance skills equally rare in the modern world. The plumbing groaned and sputtered, delivering rust-colored water for several minutes, before finally running clear. The electrical system was a hazardous patchwork of original knob and tube wiring, supplemented by updates from at least 3 different decades. He'd established a makeshift living area in what had once been the morning A room, a space with large windows that allowed ample natural light and fewer obvious structural issues than other parts of the house. A camp stove, his old mattress on the floor, and Max's dog bed created a small island of familiarity amid the faded grandeur. On the fourth morning, Ethan sat on the wide front steps, drinking coffee from a metal thermos cup and making notes in a worn notebook. The list of urgent repairs grew longer with each room he explored. The inheritance account would cover materials, but not labor. He would have to do most of the work himself or find creative solutions. Max, who had been exploring the overgrown gardens, suddenly barked and ran toward the driveway. Moments later, Sophia Reeves's Subaru appeared around the bend, moving at a cautious pace over the rutted gravel. Ethan felt a mixture of wariness and unexpected pleasure at seeing her again. Their brief meeting had left him with the impression of someone passionate and knowledgeable, if somewhat intense, about the home's previous owner. Under different circumstances, if he weren't starting over with barely enough resources to keep the roof from caving in, he might have welcomed her academic interest in the property. As it stood, he couldn't afford to get caught up in historical mysteries, not when the present demanded every ounce of his attention and energy. Sophia parked and emerged from her car carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups and a brown paper bag. Max circled her curiously, and she balanced her offerings. In one hand to greet the dog with the other. "I thought you might appreciate some decent coffee and breakfast," she called, approaching the steps. "The diner in town makes the best cinnamon rolls in the county." The gesture caught Ethan off guard. In his experience, people rarely offered help without expecting something in return, but the aroma of fresh coffee and pastry was too tempting to refuse on principle. "Thanks," he said, standing to help with the tray. "That's actually really thoughtful." Sophia smiled, and Ethan noticed how it transformed her face, softening the serious academic demeanor she'd projected during their first meeting. "Consider it a proper welcome to Raven's Hollow. Small towns run on food and favors." They settled on the steps, and Sophia handed him one of the enormous cinnamon rolls. "How's the settling in going?" Ethan gestured toward the mansion behind them. "Let's just say my farming skills don't quite translate to Victorian home restoration. That bad. I've got running water in 1 bathroom, reliable electricity in about 3 rooms, and I'm pretty sure there's a family of raccoons living in the East Wing." Sophia laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "The previous caretaker wasn't big on preventative maintenance. Mr. Hargrove managed the estate from Portland and visited maybe twice a year." "You seem to know a lot about this place," Ethan observed, biting into the cinnamon roll. It was, as promised, exceptional. "I've been researching Eleanor Blackwood for years," Sophia admitted. "The house is a significant part of her story, though I've never actually been inside." The hint was subtle, but clear. Ethan considered the museum curator sitting beside him. Her enthusiasm for history seemed genuine, and she'd made the effort to welcome him without immediately pushing her agenda. Maybe having someone who knew about the house's past could be useful rather than complicated. "I could use a second pair of eyes," he found himself saying. "If you're interested in seeing the inside, I could show you around after breakfast. Fair warning, it's not what it used to be." The surprise and delight that lit up Sophia's face made Ethan momentarily forget the mountain of work awaiting him. "I would love that," she said, "and I promise not to go full academic mode on you." Inside, the mansion told the story of its decline in layers of dust and neglect. Sophia moved through the grand entrance hall with reverent steps, taking in the curved staircase with its intricate balustrade, the tarnished chandelier hanging precariously from a medallioned ceiling, and the faded wallpaper that still hinted at its original elegance. "The craftsmanship is incredible," she murmured, running her fingers along the carved newel post. "You don't see work like this anymore. Ethan watched her reaction with growing curiosity. Where he saw endless repairs and financial drain, she saw beauty and historical significance. Her perspective was refreshing, even if he couldn't fully share it. "What was she like?" he asked as they moved into the main parlor. "Eleanor Blackwood. You seem to admire her." Sophia's expression grew animated. She was brilliant, decades ahead of her contemporaries in her archaeological methods and theories. At a time when women were barely tolerated in the field, she led major expeditions and made discoveries that changed our understanding of pre-Columbian cultures in the Americas. As they continued through the house, Sophia shared stories about Eleanor that painted a picture of a woman who defied conventions and pursued truth, regardless of the personal cost. Ethan found himself drawn into the narrative despite his initial reluctance. There was something compelling about discovering a family connection he'd never known existed. "This would have been her study," Sophia said, as they entered a room lined with empty bookshelves. "According to the records I've found, she did most of her writing and research here when she wasn't in the field." Ethan surveyed the space, noting the large bay window that would have provided excellent light for detailed work. "All the books are gone. Most of her academic collection was donated to various universities after her disappearance," Sophia explained. "But her personal papers and research notes from her final expedition were never found. They continued to the library, a two-story room that must have once been magnificent. Now, empty shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, and water damage stained one corner of the intricate parquet flooring." "That's going to need professional restoration," Sophia said, pointing to the floor. "It's Brazilian rosewood. They don't make flooring like that anymore." Ethan sighed, mentally adding another item to his growing list of expenses. "At this rate, I'll be fixing this place until I'm 80. As they moved across the room, a floorboard creaked loudly beneath Ethan's boot, then gave slightly. He stopped, testing it again with his weight. The board shifted noticeably. "Loose," he observed, kneeling to examine it more closely. "Could be rot." But as he pressed the edge of the board, it didn't feel soft with decay. Instead, it seemed to be intentionally unsecured. Curious, he applied pressure to one end, and the opposite end lifted slightly. "That's odd," Sophia said, kneeling beside him. "The parquet in this room is laid over the original pine subfloor. This piece shouldn't move independently." Something about the board's placement, centered perfectly in front of where a desk would logically have been positioned, struck Ethan as deliberate rather than accidental. Years of making do on the farm had taught him to notice when things were engineered, rather than broken. "Hand me my pocket knife," he said, gesturing toward the tool clipped to his belt. Sophia passed it to him, and he carefully worked the blade into the small gap, levering up the board. It came free with surprising ease, revealing a narrow space beneath. Rather than showing the expected subfloor, the cavity contained a flat metal box about the size of a large hardcover book. They looked at each other, mutual surprise reflected in their expressions. Without a word, Ethan reached down and lifted the box from its hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy, made of what appeared to be steel with a simple clasp that had been secured with an old padlock. "This was deliberately hidden," Sophia whispered, her academic detachment momentarily forgotten in the excitement of discovery. Ethan turned the box, examining the lock. "No key, obviously, but this is an old padlock. Shouldn't be too difficult to open." He stood, carrying the box to a nearby window where the light was better. Sophia followed, her eyes never leaving their discovery. "Do you think it belonged to her, to Eleanor?" There was an almost childlike excitement in her voice. "One way to find out," Ethan replied, already working the blade of his knife into the mechanism of the lock. Years of repairing farm equipment had given him a practical understanding of how things worked and how to make them work when they didn't want to. The lock resisted briefly, then surrendered with a soft click. Ethan removed it and looked at Sophia. "Ready?" She nodded, moving closer. He opened the lid slowly, revealing the contents. A leather-bound journal, several yellowed manila envelopes, what appeared to be a small cloth pouch, and nestled beneath. "These," something wrapped carefully in aged muslin. Sophia gasped softly. "These are definitely Eleanor's. I recognize her handwriting from the archival materials I've studied." She gently lifted the journal, opening it with reverent care. "This is her field journal from the Zacatecas expedition, her last documented work before she disappeared. It's been missing for decades." Ethan watched as she delicately turned the pages, her trained eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "What does it say?" "It's her research notes, site documentation." Sophia's voice trailed off as she reached a section near the end. "Wait, this contradicts the official record. According to this, she didn't disappear during the expedition. She returned with something significant enough that she felt it needed to be protected." Ethan turned his attention to the cloth-wrapped object at the bottom of the box. It was heavy and solid, approximately the size of a softball. Carefully, he lifted it and began to unwrap the protective layers of fabric, revealing what lay hidden inside. As the final layer fell away, both Ethan and Sophia fell silent, staring at what rested in his palm. A small statue, intricately carved from what appeared to be solid gold, depicting a seated figure with elaborate headdress and ceremonial garments. Even to Ethan's untrained eye, it was clearly ancient and extraordinarily valuable. "That's Mayan," Sophia whispered, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Possibly late classic period. And if it's solid gold, Ethan, this is a museum-quality artifact. It shouldn't be in private hands. It would have required special permits to remove from its country of origin." Ethan looked from the golden figure to Sophia's flushed face, then back to the box with its remaining contents. In an instant, his straightforward plan for rebuilding his life had become infinitely more complicated. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood had hidden beneath the library floor represented both tremendous value and potential legal complications he couldn't begin to comprehend. "There's more," he said, gesturing to the envelopes still in the box. "A lot more to unpack here." Sophia nodded, her professional demeanor reasserting itself. "We should document everything carefully before we proceed. If these are what I think they are, historical artifacts removed from their country of origin, there are ethical and legal considerations involved." Ethan carefully rewrapped the golden statue, his farmer's practicality warring with the extraordinary circumstances. He'd come to Blackwood Manor seeking a fresh start, a place to rebuild his life after losing everything. Instead, he'd stumbled into what appeared to be a hidden collection of potentially priceless and possibly illegally obtained archaeological treasures. As he looked at Sophia, now carefully examining the remaining contents of the box, he realized their lives had become unexpectedly intertwined by this discovery. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood had hidden beneath the floorboards would force both of them to confront questions of value, ownership, and responsibility that neither had anticipated when the day began. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Sophia looked up, her expression a complex mixture of academic excitement and growing concern. "That depends on what else we find in these papers, and what you want to do with them." The unspoken question hung between them. Was Ethan Caldwell, a farmer who had lost everything and come to Blackwood Manor seeking a second chance, prepared to surrender what might be a fortune in ancient artifacts in the name of historical and ethical responsibility? Neither of them had an answer yet, but as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the library windows, illuminating the dust particles disturbed by their discovery, both knew that the simple relationship of new neighbor and welcoming local had transformed into something far more complicated and potentially life-changing for them both. By evening, Ethan and Sophia had moved their unexpected discovery to the morning room. spreading the contents of the metal box across the folding table Ethan had been using as a desk. Max lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head to observe their hushed conversation, before settling back down with a contented sigh. The golden statue sat at the center of the table, catching the light from the vintage lamp Ethan had rewired his first day at the mansion. Around it, they had arranged Eleanor Blackwood's journal, several maps with handwritten notations, a collection of black and white photographs documenting archaeological sites, and a series of letters that appeared to be correspondence between Eleanor and various colleagues. "This is extraordinary," Sophia said, carefully turning the pages of the journal. According to these notes, Eleanor discovered a previously unknown ceremonial chamber during her expedition to Zacatecas. The official reports never mentioned this. Ethan leaned forward, studying one of the photographs that showed a stone chamber with intricate carvings covering the walls. Why would she keep it secret? And why hide these things under the floorboards? Sophia's finger traced a passage in the journal. "Listen to this. The discovery exceeds all expectations, but concerns about institutional interference and potential exploitation compel me to proceed with utmost discretion. Some truths are too valuable to be subjected to political agendas and academic territorialism." She looked up, eyes bright with excitement. She was deliberately keeping these findings private. The question is, why? As they continued examining the materials, a narrative began to emerge from Eleanor's meticulous notes. The expedition had uncovered evidence that challenged established theories about Mayan-Aztec cultural exchange, suggesting connections that crossed both geographical and temporal boundaries previously thought impossible. The artifacts themselves aren't just valuable because they're gold, Sophia explained, gently turning the statue to examine the intricate detailing. Their real value is in what they tell us about ancient civilizations and their relationships. According to Eleanor's notes, this collection represents evidence of a historical narrative that contradicts the established academic consensus. Which means what exactly? Ethan asked, trying to understand the significance beyond the obvious material value. Sophia considered this for a moment. Imagine discovering that something you've been taught as historical fact your entire life was actually incorrect. These artifacts could potentially rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations in the Americas. Ethan nodded slowly. And that kind of discovery would make these things valuable to a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. Exactly. Sophia carefully set down the golden statue. Museums, universities, private collectors, the governments of countries where they originated, they all would have competing claims and interests. The implications hung heavily between them. What had begun as a simple home renovation project had suddenly become entangled with questions of historical significance, international law, and potentially enormous financial considerations. Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the overgrown grounds of Blackwood Manor as darkness settled over the landscape. His practical farmer's mind was already calculating angles and possibilities. The golden statue alone could probably cover the cost of renovating the entire mansion. The collection as a whole might be worth enough to establish him comfortably for life, but there was something about Eleanor's careful documentation and deliberate hiding of these artifacts that gave him pause. She had clearly valued them beyond their monetary worth, seeing in them a historical truth she felt compelled to protect. "We need more information before we make any decisions," he said finally, turning back to Sophia. "About the legal implications, about what Eleanor was trying to protect, about all of it." Sophia nodded, relief evident in her expression. She had clearly been concerned that Ethan might immediately focus on the collection's financial potential, rather than its historical significance. "I can research the legal aspects," she offered, "and I have academic contacts who might provide insights." Discreetly, of course, without revealing what we've found. Ethan checked his watch, surprised to find that hours had passed since their discovery. It's late. We should probably call it a day and continue tomorrow. Sophia began carefully returning the artifacts to their metal container, her movements deliberate and reverent. I don't think these should stay here, at least not until we've decided how to proceed. The mansion isn't secure, and these items are irreplaceable. Ethan considered this. Where would you suggest? The museum has a climate-controlled vault. Not state-of-the-art, but better than here. I'm the only one with access. She hesitated, then added, I understand if you're not comfortable with that. They are, legally speaking, your property now. The question of ownership hadn't fully registered with Ethan until that moment. As Eleanor's heir, he supposed the artifacts technically belonged to him, but the idea felt strange. How could anyone truly own historical objects of such significance? Let's take them to your vault, he decided. They'll be safer there while we figure this out. The Raven's Hollow. Historical Society and Museum occupied a handsome brick building that had once been the town library. Its columned entrance and broad steps gave it a dignity that belied its modest size. As Sophia led Ethan through the darkened exhibition spaces, the beam of her flashlight illuminated display cases containing local historical items, logging equipment, Native American artifacts, photographs documenting the town's heyday as a lumber center. Not exactly the Smithsonian, she said with a self-deprecating smile, but we do our best to preserve what history we can. They reached a door marked Authorized Personnel Only, which opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading down to the basement level. The temperature noticeably dropped as they descended. Our glamorous storage facilities, Sophia explained, leading him through rows of metal shelves containing labeled boxes and artifacts awaiting display or restoration. At the far end of the room stood a large safe with a digital keypad. This was installed when the building was briefly used as a bank branch in the 1980s, she said, entering a code. Not many valuable items in Raven's Hollow worth stealing these days, but it's perfect for our purposes. The safe opened with a heavy click, revealing a space about the size of a walk-in closet lined with adjustable shelving. Sophia cleared a space on the center shelf and carefully positioned the metal box. I'll create a preliminary catalog tomorrow, she said, as she closed and secured the safe. That will help us understand exactly what we're dealing with. As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Ethan noticed a poster announcing Town Hall Meeting, Museum Funding Vote, Your Voice Matters, with the following week's date prominently displayed. What's this about? He asked, pointing to the poster. Sophia's expression tightened. Budget cuts. The town council is voting on whether to reduce the museum's funding by 60% or eliminate it entirely. They would close the museum. It's a non-essential service, according to Mayor Wilson, Sophia said, the bitterness in her voice unmistakable. In a town struggling to maintain basic infrastructure, history is seen as a luxury. Ethan studied the earnest face of the woman who had spent the day helping him understand the significance of their discovery. Her passion for preserving the past was evident in everything she did, from the careful way she handled the artifacts to her encyclopedic knowledge of Eleanor Blackwood's work. What happens to you if they close it? Sophia shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her concern. I'll find another position somewhere. There are museums and universities that would value my expertise, though probably not in small towns like this. She didn't have to spell out what would be lost if she left. Not just her job, but her connection to Eleanor's legacy and the community that had shaped it. The parallel to Ethan's own recent uprooting wasn't lost on him. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, scented with pine from the surrounding forests. Streetlights illuminated the quiet main street. Most businesses already closed for the night. A single restaurant remained open, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness. "Are you hungry?" Ethan asked, suddenly realizing they had worked through dinner in their absorption with Eleanor's artifacts. "I owe you a meal after the cinnamon roll this morning." Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "Mabel's stays open late on Fridays. They make a decent burger." The restaurant was nearly empty. Just a couple of locals at the counter and a tired-looking waitress refilling coffee cups. They slid into a booth near the back, where they could talk without being overheard. After ordering, Ethan found himself studying Sophia with new interest. In the soft lighting of the restaurant, she looked younger. The intensity that had characterized her during their examination of the artifacts softened by exhaustion and hunger. "How did you end up as the curator of a small-town museum?" he asked. "You clearly have the expertise for a more prestigious position." Sophia took a sip of her water, considering her answer. "I was on track for a university career, PhD from Columbia, postdoc opportunities lined up. But the more I researched Eleanor Blackwood, the more I became convinced that the conventional narrative about her disappearance was incomplete." "So, you came here to investigate, initially just for a summer research project, but once I was here, I discovered the museum was on the verge of closing after the previous curator retired. The collection would have been dispersed, Eleanor's local connections forgotten." She shrugged. "I applied for the position, thinking it would be temporary. That was 3 years ago. Their food arrived, burgers and fries on heavy ceramic plates that had probably been in use since the restaurant opened decades ago. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, both hungrier than they had realized. "What about you?" Sophia finally asked. "How does a farmer from Eastern Oregon end up inheriting a Victorian mansion?" Ethan's expression clouded slightly. "Drought. 3 years of it turned viable farmland into dust. The bank foreclosed, and the letter about this inheritance arrived literally the day after I got my final notice." "I'm sorry," Sophia said, and Ethan could tell she meant it. Losing a family farm must be devastating. "It was all I'd ever known," he admitted. 3 generations of Caldwells worked that land, and I was the one who lost it. You couldn't control the weather." "No. But I could have diversified, installed better irrigation, maybe leased more land for solar farms, instead of trying to grow crops in soil that was turning to dust." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Sophia was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Sometimes the most valuable thing we inherit isn't property or possessions, but resilience. You didn't give up. You found a new path forward." Her words struck closer to home than she could have known. Ethan had been so focused on what he'd lost that he hadn't fully considered the opportunity that had unexpectedly opened before him. Not just the mansion with its hidden treasures, but the chance to redefine himself and his future. As they finished their meal, the waitress approached with the check, her curious gaze moving between them. "You must be the fellow who bought the old Blackwood place," she said to Ethan. "Word travels fast around here." "Apparently," Ethan replied with a wry smile. "Brave man," she commented. "That house has been nothing but trouble for years. Some folks say it's haunted by Eleanor Blackwood herself." Sophia rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "Mabel, don't start with the ghost stories. Mr. Caldwell has enough to deal with fixing the actual physical problems with the house." Mabel shrugged, unconvinced. "All I know is strange things happen up at that mansion. Always have." She glanced at Sophia. "Though I suppose having our local historian on his side might help navigate the weirdness." After she moved away, Ethan raised an eyebrow at Sophia. "Haunted? Small towns love their legends," she said dismissively. "Every old house has a ghost story attached to it. And what's this about strange things happening at the mansion?" Sophia hesitated, then said, There have been rumors over the years, lights seen in the windows when the house was supposed to be empty, unusual sounds, that sort of thing. Probably just local kids exploring or wildlife getting in through broken windows. But there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. Ethan decided not to press the issue. They had enough real mysteries to solve without adding supernatural ones to the mix. As they walked back to their respective vehicles, a comfortable silence settled between them. In the space of a single day, they had moved from strangers to co-conspirators, bound together by Eleanor Blackwood's hidden legacy. "We should be careful who we tell about this," Ethan said as they reached the museum parking lot, "at least until we understand what we're dealing with." Sophia nodded. "Agreed. For now, let's keep this between us." She hesitated, then added, "I'm giving a presentation at the town council meeting next week, trying to save the museum's funding. Would you come? Having a new resident speak about the importance of preserving local history might help sway some votes." The request was simple, but carried weight. Ethan was still an outsider, newly arrived and unknown. His presence at a town meeting supporting the museum would be a public alignment with Sophia and her cause, a statement about where he stood and what he valued. "I'll be there," he promised, surprising himself with how easily the commitment came. As he drove back to Blackwood Manor, the headlights of his truck cutting through the darkness of the winding road, Ethan reflected on the day's developments. He had come to Raven's Hollow, seeking nothing more than a roof over his head and a chance to rebuild. Instead, he had found himself thrust into a historical mystery, a potential fortune in artifacts, and an unexpected alliance with a passionate historian who saw value in things others had forgotten or ignored. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood had hidden beneath the library floor had already begun to change the course of his life in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The question now was whether that change would lead to salvation or complication, or perhaps, most likely, both. The following days established a rhythm that neither Ethan nor Sophia had anticipated. Mornings were devoted to essential repairs. At Blackwood Manor, fixing leaks, securing loose shutters, and making the house minimally habitable. Sophia would arrive with coffee and local gossip, then don work gloves and assist with whatever project Ethan had deemed most urgent that day. Afternoons found them in the museum's basement, carefully cataloguing and researching Eleanor's collection. The golden statue they had initially discovered proved to be just one of several significant artifacts, each meticulously documented in Eleanor's journal, with notes about its provenance and historical significance. "According to these notes," Sophia said on the fifth day, pointing to a passage in the journal, Eleanor believed these artifacts provided evidence of a previously unknown connection between Mayan and Aztec ceremonial practices. If she's right, it challenges the entire established timeline of cultural development in Mesoamerica. Ethan, who had been photographing a small jade pendant carved with intricate symbols, looked up. "And that's why she kept them hidden? Because the discovery was controversial?" Sophia frowned, turning to the final pages of the journal. "It's more complicated than that. Listen to this entry, dated just 2 weeks before her reported disappearance. Hargrove continues to pressure me about the artifacts. His interest exceeds academic curiosity. I suspect financial motivations. The collection must remain concealed until I can ensure its proper handling and protection." "Hargrove," Ethan repeated. "As in the lawyer who managed the estate?" "Possibly." "His father or grandfather," Sophia mused. "The Hargrove firm has represented the Blackwood family for generations." The implications hung between them. If Eleanor had been hiding these artifacts from someone she didn't trust, even someone connected to her own family's legal representation, the situation was more complex than they had initially assumed. As Ethan drove back to the mansion that evening, he found himself increasingly drawn into the mystery of Eleanor Blackwood. and her hidden collection. What had begun as a simple matter of deciding what to do with unexpected valuable objects had evolved into something far more intriguing, a historical puzzle with pieces still missing. He was so absorbed in these thoughts that he almost missed the sleek black SUV parked at the entrance to the mansion's driveway. A man in an expensive-looking suit stood beside it, consulting something on his phone. As Ethan's truck approached, the man looked up and raised a hand in greeting. Ethan pulled to a stop, rolling down his window with a sense of wariness. Visitors to Blackwood Manor had been non-existent apart from Sophia and the occasional delivery of construction materials he'd ordered. "Mr. Caldwell?" The man stepped forward, extending a business card. "William Hargrove. My firm handled your great-aunt's estate. I hope I'm not intruding, but I was in the area and wanted to check how you're settling in." Ethan took the card, instantly making the connection to the name in Eleanor's journal. "Bit of a coincidence," he said carefully. "I was just reading about a Hargrove in some old family papers." Something flickered across William Hargrove's polished expression, too quickly to identify, but enough to register as significant. "My grandfather and father before me served as counsel to the Blackwood family. Tradition of service, you might say." "Well, I appreciate the check-in," Ethan said, deliberately casual. "As you can see, I've got my work cut out for me with the place." Hargrove surveyed the mansion with what appeared to be casual interest, though Ethan sensed a more focused assessment beneath the lawyer's affable manner. "Indeed, it was quite generous of Vivian to leave you the property, given the, distant nature of your relation." There was a subtle emphasis on distant that Ethan couldn't miss, a gentle reminder that his claim to the Blackwood legacy was tenuous at best. "Would you mind if I came in for a quick tour?" Hargrove continued. "Professional curiosity. I've managed the estate for years, but rarely had occasion to inspect the interior." Warning bells sounded in Ethan's mind. The timing of this visit, days after they'd discovered Eleanor's hidden collection, seemed too convenient to be coincidental, but refusing would only raise suspicion. "Sure," he said, forcing a friendly tone. "Though I should warn you, it's pretty rough inside. I'm still in the early stages of making it livable." As he led Hargrove through the mansion, Ethan was acutely aware of the library floor where they had found the hidden compartment. He deliberately steered the lawyer away from that room, claiming structural concerns about the ceiling that made it unsafe to enter. Hargrove seemed particularly interested in Eleanor's former study, examining the empty bookshelves and asking casual questions about any papers or personal effects Ethan might have found during his renovations. "Most everything of value was cleared out long ago," Ethan lied smoothly, drawing on years of poker games with neighboring farmers. "Just furniture and fixtures left, mostly in bad shape." "A shame," Hargrove said, running a manicured finger along a dusty windowsill. Eleanor Blackwood was quite a notable figure in her field. Any personal papers or research notes would have significant historical interest. "I'll keep an eye out," Ethan promised, directing them back toward the front entrance. "If I find anything, I'll be sure to let you know." As Hargrove prepared to leave, he paused on the front steps. "One more thing, Mr. Caldwell. I understand you've been spending time with Dr. Reeves from the local museum." The statement, delivered casually but with unmistakable intent, confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Someone was watching either him, Sophia, or both. "Small town," Ethan replied with a shrug. "Not many people my age around. She's been friendly, showing me the local spots." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Just be aware that Dr. Reeves has a somewhat obsessive interest in Eleanor Blackwood. She's approached my firm multiple times over the years, requesting access to private family papers and the mansion itself. We've always declined, as was Vivian's wish." "I'll keep that in mind," Ethan said neutrally. After Hargrove departed, Ethan immediately called Sophia, who answered on the first ring. "Hargrove just paid me a visit," he said, without preamble. "William Hargrove?" Sophia's voice sharpened. "What did he want?" "Officially, to welcome me and check on the property. Unofficially, he seemed very interested in whether I'd found any of Eleanor's papers or research notes." "That can't be a coincidence," Sophia said, echoing Ethan's earlier thought. "Not days after we find her hidden collection." He also made a point of mentioning you, said you had an obsessive interest in Eleanor and had tried to get access to family papers several times. Sophia's laugh held little humor. Of course he'd frame it that way. "I made formal academic requests through proper channels. The Hargrove firm has consistently blocked any scholarly access to Eleanor's papers, claiming to follow family directives." "Do you think he knows what we found?" "Impossible to be certain," Sophia replied, "but his timing is suspicious. We should accelerate our research, figure out exactly what we're dealing with before anyone else gets involved." After ending the call, Ethan walked through the mansion with new awareness, checking windows and doors, securing what he could. For the first time since arriving, he felt vulnerable in the sprawling old house, as if the walls themselves might be watching. The next morning, Ethan was awakened by the sound of a vehicle coming up the driveway. He looked out the window to see Sophia's Subaru approaching much earlier than usual, moving at a speed that suggested urgency. He met her at the front door, immediately noticing her disheveled appearance and the tension in her expression. "Someone broke into the museum last night," she said without greeting. "The vault was tampered with." Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "The artifacts, still secure," Sophia assured him, following him inside. "The vault held, and the alarms scared them off before they could finish the job, but they knew what they were looking for, Ethan. This wasn't random vandalism." She handed him her tablet, showing security camera footage from the museum. The image quality was poor, but it clearly showed a figure in dark clothing attempting to access the vault, face obscured by a ski mask. "Police are treating it as an ordinary break-in," Sophia continued. "They have no reason to suspect anything valuable is in there. I didn't tell them about the artifacts." Ethan studied the footage again. "Hargrove. No way to prove it," Sophia said. "But the timing is too perfect to be coincidence. He visits you, asks about Eleanor's papers, and that night someone tries to break into the vault. How would he know we found anything, let alone where we're keeping it?" Sophia paced the room. A habit Ethan had noticed emerged when she was thinking intensely. Maybe he doesn't know specifically, but Hargrove's firm has been obsessed with controlling Eleanor's legacy for decades. If you connected with me, the local expert on Eleanor, his suspicions would be natural. "We need a better hiding place," Ethan decided. "Somewhere neither of us would be connected to." Sophia nodded agreement. "And we need to finish documenting everything quickly. The more we understand about what Eleanor discovered and why she hid it, the better position we'll be in to protect it." They spent the day photographing every item in the collection, transcribing Eleanor's notes, and researching the specific archaeological sites mentioned in her journal. By evening, a coherent narrative had begun to emerge, one that explained both the significance of the artifacts and potentially why Eleanor had gone to such lengths to keep them hidden. According to these notes, Sophia explained, pointing to a series of passages they had cross-referenced, Eleanor discovered evidence that contradicted the academic consensus about cultural development in Mesoamerica. But more importantly, she found proof that certain artifacts previously authenticated and displayed in major museums were actually sophisticated forgeries. Ethan looked up from the map he'd been examining. Forgeries? As in fakes? Exactly. Eleanor's research suggested that sometime in the 1950s, a collection of supposedly ancient Mayan artifacts had been created by modern artisans and then discovered through officially sanctioned archaeological expeditions. These forgeries were then authenticated by experts who were either deceived or complicit. That would be a massive scandal, Ethan observed. More than that, Sophia said, her eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. It would undermine decades of academic research, call into question the provenance of major museum collections, and potentially involve fraud at the highest levels of the archaeological establishment. The implications were staggering. If Eleanor had discovered evidence of such widespread deception, it explained why she might have felt the need to hide her findings until she could determine how best to reveal the truth. So who would want to suppress this information, Ethan asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Anyone with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, Sophia replied. Museums with these forgeries in their collections, academics whose reputations were built on research involving them, dealers who had sold similar pieces to wealthy collectors, and lawyers representing those interests, Ethan added, thinking of Hargrove's too convenient visit. Their eyes met across the table, mutual understanding passing between them. What had begun as a simple discovery of hidden valuables had evolved into something far more significant and potentially dangerous. Eleanor Blackwood hadn't just hidden a collection of gold artifacts. She had concealed evidence of a systematic deception that reached into the highest echelons of the academic and museum world. And now, decades later, someone still seemed determined to keep that evidence buried. We can't just turn this over to authorities or announce it publicly, Sophia said, voicing what they were both thinking. Not until we understand the full scope and can protect the collection. And ourselves. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. When he'd inherited Blackwood Manor, he'd been seeking nothing more than a roof over his head and a chance to rebuild his life. Now he found himself the custodian of a historical truth that powerful people might prefer to keep hidden. So what's our next move? He asked. Sophia gathered her notes, a determined expression replacing her earlier tension. We need to understand exactly who was involved in this deception and who might still have reasons to keep it quiet. Eleanor's journal mentions specific names: academics, museum directors, even government officials. We need to trace what happened to these people and who inherited their positions and interests. As they outlined their plan for the coming days, neither spoke aloud the question that hung between them. How far would those with vested interests in keeping Eleanor's discovery hidden be willing to go to ensure their secrets remained buried? The attempted break-in at the museum suggested they might already have their answer, and it wasn't reassuring. The town council meeting was held in Ravens Hollow's community centre, a sturdy WPA-era building that had served various purposes throughout its life, from high school gymnasium to emergency shelter during the flood of '96. Tonight it was filled nearly to capacity, with rows of folding chairs occupied by concerned citizens. Ethan arrived just as the meeting was beginning, slipping into a seat near the back. He scanned the room, noting the distinct divisions among the attendees. On one side sat older residents, many of whom Ethan recognized from his growing familiarity with local businesses. On the other, a group of younger adults and families, many dressed in clothing that suggested outdoor professions, the working backbone of the small community. At the front of the room, a long table accommodated the 7 members of the town council, with Mayor Wilson at the center. The mayor was a square-built man in his 60s, with the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to having the final word. Beside him sat a younger man Ethan recognized with a start, William Hargrove, apparently serving as legal counsel to the council. Sophia stood at a small podium facing the council, her professional attire and careful composure a stark contrast to the anxiety Ethan knew she must be feeling. Behind her, a projection screen displayed photographs of community events held at the museum over the past year. The Ravens Hollow Historical Society and Museum isn't just a building housing old objects, she was saying, her voice clear and measured. It's the keeper of our community's story, the thread that connects our present to our past. She clicked to the next slide, showing a group of elementary school children engaged in what appeared to be a hands-on history lesson. Last year alone, we hosted 36 school groups, providing educational experiences that supplement our underfunded school curriculum. Mayor Wilson checked his watch, the gesture deliberately visible. Dr. Reeves, we appreciate your passion, but the financial realities facing our town are straightforward. We simply cannot afford to maintain non-essential services at their current funding levels. Sophia's composure didn't waver. I understand budget constraints, Mayor. That's why I've prepared a compromise proposal that would reduce costs while preserving essential functions. She distributed folders to each council member. This plan includes reducing operating hours, implementing a modest admission fee for non-residents, and developing community volunteer programs to supplement staffing. Hargrove leaned over to whisper something to the mayor, who nodded almost imperceptibly before addressing Sophia again. The issue isn't just operational costs, Dr. Reeves. The building itself requires significant maintenance and upgrades to meet current code requirements. The estimates for necessary repairs exceed $50,000. A murmur ran through the audience. It was a substantial sum for a small town already struggling with infrastructure challenges. The museum building is structurally sound, Sophia countered. The assessment you're citing includes cosmetic improvements that could be deferred or addressed through community volunteer efforts. Safety and accessibility aren't cosmetic concerns, Hargrove interjected smoothly. They're legal requirements that expose the town to liability if not addressed. The back and forth continued, with Sophia presenting well-researched responses to each objection raised. But Ethan could see that most council members had already made their decisions. This meeting was a formality, not a genuine deliberation. When public comments were invited, several residents spoke passionately about the museum's value to the community. An elderly woman recalled how the museum had helped her grandson connect with his local heritage. A middle school teacher described irreplaceable educational opportunities that would be lost if the museum closed. Then, to Ethan's surprise, his name was called. "We understand we have a new resident with us tonight," Mayor Wilson announced. "Mr. Ethan Caldwell, the new owner of Blackwood Manor. Would you care to share your perspective as someone new to our community?" The invitation was a calculated move, asking the outsider's opinion would allow the council to dismiss local sentiments as emotional rather than practical. Ethan felt dozens of curious gazes turn in his direction as he stood and made his way to the podium. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, preferring the solitude of farm work to community meetings. But as he took Sophia's place at the microphone, he found himself thinking of the hidden artifacts, of Eleanor Blackwood's determination to protect historical truth, and of Sophia's unwavering commitment to the same principles. "I didn't come here planning to speak," he began, his voice rough with unaccustomed use in such a setting. "And I recognize that as a newcomer, my opinion on local matters carries less weight than those who've built their lives here." He paused, surveying the room, but sometimes an outsider sees things differently. Where I come from, where I used to farm, we had to make hard decisions during drought years. Cut here, reduce there, abandon this field to save that one. The farming metaphor resonated with many in the audience, who nodded in understanding. What I learned through those decisions is that some cuts, while they save money in the short term, cost you everything in the long run. You can't just think about this season's yield. You have to consider what you're planting for the future. Ethan turned to face the council directly. Your museum isn't just a building full of old things. It's the seed bank of your community's identity. Once you lose that connection to your past, it's almost impossible to restore. He gestured towards Sophia, standing quietly at the side of the room. Dr. Reeves isn't just preserving artifacts. She's safeguarding the story of who you are and where you came from. That has value that can't be calculated on a balance sheet. Mayor Wilson shifted uncomfortably. We all appreciate sentiment, Mr. Caldwell, but sentiment doesn't fix roads or maintain water systems. No, Ethan agreed, but it does build communities worth having roads to reach. He took a deep breath, making a decision he hadn't planned on when he entered the building, which is why I'd like to propose a public-private partnership. As the new owner of Blackwood Manor, I'm willing to establish a community foundation to support the museum's operating costs for the next 3 years, giving Dr. Reeves time to implement her sustainability plan. A stunned silence fell over the room, followed by a buzz of surprised conversation. Sophia's eyes had widened in shock, her carefully composed expression momentarily fractured by genuine surprise. That's an unexpected offer, Mayor Wilson said, clearly thrown off balance. However, the building repairs remain a significant concern. I'm also prepared to donate construction materials and personally assist with necessary repairs to bring the building up to code, Ethan continued, committed now to the path he'd chosen. I have experience with structural renovation, as anyone who's seen the current state of Blackwood Manor might guess. A ripple of appreciative laughter broke the tension in the room. Hargrove's expression had darkened, his posture stiffening as he leaned forward. While Mr. Caldwell's generosity is commendable, we must consider the long-term sustainability beyond a 3-year commitment. Furthermore, there are legal considerations regarding private funding of public institutions, all of which can be properly structured through standard foundation protocols, Ethan countered, drawing on knowledge gained through years of navigating farm subsidies and agricultural grants. I'm not offering a handout. I'm proposing an investment in this community, the community I've chosen as my new home. The meeting adjourned with the council agreeing to postpone their vote pending a formal proposal from Ethan and a review of legal considerations. As the crowd dispersed, many residents approached Ethan with handshakes and words of appreciation, no longer viewing him as an outsider, but as an unexpected champion of their community's heritage. Sophia waited until they were alone in the parking lot before speaking. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. The foundation, the repairs, that's a significant commitment. Ethan leaned against his truck, suddenly tired from the unexpected emotional exertion of public speaking and community politics. I'm not sure I had a choice, not after everything we've discovered. The artifacts aren't your responsibility, Sophia persisted. Neither is the museum or this town. Maybe not, Ethan conceded, but I'm starting to think Eleanor Blackwood knew exactly what she was doing when she arranged for me to inherit the mansion. Sophia studied him in the dim glow of the parking lot lights. What do you mean? It's probably nothing, Ethan said, suddenly self-conscious about the half-formed thought. Just a feeling that there's more to this inheritance than random chance or distant family connections. The night air had grown cool, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding forests. Sophia wrapped her arms around herself against the chill, and without thinking, Ethan shrugged out of his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. The gesture, simple and instinctive, created a moment of unexpected intimacy between them. Sophia looked up at him, her expression softening from professional gratitude to something more personal. "Thank you," she said quietly, "not just for the jacket, for everything." For a heartbeat, Ethan thought she might step closer, might bridge the small space that separated them. Instead, she glanced away, her professional demeanor returning like a shield. "I should go," It's late, and we have a lot of work to do tomorrow with the artifacts. Right, Ethan agreed, suddenly aware of the complex emotions swirling beneath their practical partnership. Tomorrow. As Sophia drove away, Ethan remained in the parking lot, sorting through the evening's events and his own unexpected actions. When he'd arrived in Raven's Hollow, he'd been focused solely on personal survival, finding shelter, rebuilding some semblance of stability after losing everything. He hadn't planned on involving himself in community politics or making substantial financial commitments to local institutions, and he certainly hadn't planned on developing feelings for an academically brilliant, passionately committed museum curator who viewed him primarily as a custodian of historical artifacts. Yet here he was, watching her taillights disappear around the bend, already thinking about how to structure the foundation he'd impulsively proposed and how to find the funds to fulfill his promise. The drive back to Blackwood Manor took Ethan along winding forest roads, the headlights of his truck illuminating the mist that had begun to gather in the hollows between hills. As he approached the mansion, he was struck anew by its imposing silhouette against the night sky, no longer a desperate last resort, but a responsibility and an opportunity he was beginning to embrace. Max greeted him at the door with enthusiastic tail-wagging, a reminder that some loyalties remained uncomplicated by historical mysteries and unexpected emotions. "Just you and me figuring this out, buddy," Ethan told the dog as they walked through the darkened halls to his makeshift bedroom. "Though I'm pretty sure I just committed us to a lot more than fixing leaky pipes." That night, Ethan dreamed of Eleanor Blackwood, not as she appeared in the photograph Sophia had shown him, but as an elderly woman with knowing eyes who walked with him through the mansion, pointing out hidden compartments and secret passages he had yet to discover in his waking hours. "You're here for a reason," Dream Eleanor told him, her voice resonant with certainty. "The truth needs a keeper with roots in the soil and eyes on the horizon." He woke before dawn, the dream still vivid in his mind, with a certainty that there was more to find within the mansion's walls, and a growing conviction that his arrival in Raven's Hollow was not the random chance it had first appeared to be. The first light of morning filtered through the windows. Ethan made coffee and sat on the front porch with Max at his feet, watching the mist lift from the overgrown gardens. The magnitude of what he had committed to the previous night should have terrified him, pledging resources he didn't yet have to save a museum in a town where he'd lived barely 2 weeks. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since the day the bank had foreclosed on his family farm. Perhaps this was what Eleanor had meant in her journal about finding the right place for truth to be preserved, not just physical artifacts, but the intangible values they represented. By the time Sophia's car appeared on the driveway, Ethan had outlined a preliminary plan for the foundation and made a list of potential resources for the museum repairs. Something had shifted between them, between him and this place, between his past and his future. He wasn't just a broke farmer using an inheritance to buy time anymore. He was becoming a steward of something larger than himself. And as Sophia stepped from her car, still wearing his jacket from the night before, Ethan realized that the artifacts weren't the only valuable things he had discovered since coming to Blackwood Manor. 3 months after discovering Eleanor Blackwood's hidden artifacts, Ethan stood in the newly renovated main gallery of the Raven's Hollow Museum, surveying the transformation around him. What had once been a struggling small-town institution was now the center of unexpected archaeological attention. Display cases gleamed under carefully calibrated lighting, presenting Eleanor's collection alongside comprehensive explanations of their historical significance. The exhibition, titled Hidden Truth: The Eleanor Blackwood Discovery, would open to the public tomorrow, Tonight was the private preview for donors, local officials, and select members of the academic community who had traveled to this remote corner of Oregon to witness what many were calling the most significant archaeological revelation of the decade. "You clean up nicely, farmer," Sophia's voice came from behind him. "I barely recognized you without sawdust in your hair." Ethan turned to find her transformed from the practical curator he'd come to know into an elegant woman in a deep blue dress, her dark hair swept up to reveal the graceful line of her neck. The only familiar element was the intelligent sparkle in her eyes. "You look remarkable," he managed, suddenly aware of his own unfamiliar suit. The journey to this moment had been neither simple nor straightforward. After the attempted theft of Eleanor's journal during the severe storm that had damaged the mansion, they had faced opposition from multiple fronts: legal challenges from the Hargrove firm, pressure from institutions implicated in Eleanor's research, and even threats designed to intimidate them into keeping the discoveries private. The turning point had come when Ethan made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than selling the artifacts to the highest bidder or donating them to a prestigious museum, he had established the Blackwood Foundation with a bold mission: to create a research center at Ravens Hollow using Blackwood Manor as its headquarters. Initial skepticism had given way to cautious support when several prominent archaeologists, excited by the significance of Eleanor's discoveries, agreed to serve as scientific advisors. The foundation had secured grants sufficient to fund both the museum's renovation and the first phase of converting Blackwood Manor into a research facility. "Professor Kimura is examining the Mayan calendar piece," Sophia said, nodding toward a distinguished Japanese archaeologist deep in conversation with Miguel, now the museum's assistant curator. "He's already confirmed Eleanor's dating assessment." The validation of Eleanor's research had been particularly meaningful for Sophia, whose academic reputation had initially been questioned when she supported the controversial findings. Now, scholars who had once dismissed her were seeking her insights and collaboration. Mayor Wilson approached them, his initial opposition to the museum having evolved into enthusiastic support once the economic benefits of archaeological tourism became apparent. "Dr. Reeves, Mr. Caldwell," he greeted them warmly. "The governor just called to confirm she'll be attending the official opening tomorrow. This is tremendous publicity for Ravens Hollow." As the mayor moved on to greet other guests, Ethan and Sophia exchanged knowing smiles. The political machinations that had once threatened the museum's existence had been transformed into eager support by the prospect of economic development and national recognition. They made their way through the crowd to where the golden statue, the first artifact they had discovered in Eleanor's hidden cache, stood in a specially designed display case. The lighting had been calibrated to highlight the intricate craftsmanship without damaging the ancient gold. Beside it, a large photograph showed Eleanor Blackwood at the original excavation site, her expression conveying the excitement of discovery. "She would be pleased," Ethan said quietly, studying the image of the woman whose legacy had so unexpectedly intertwined with his own. "Not just that her research is finally being recognized, but that it's happening here, in the community she called home." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I used to wonder why she never published her findings, why she chose to hide the artifacts rather than fight the academic establishment. Now I understand. She was protecting the truth until the right moment and the right people could bring it to light." "The right person was already here," Ethan said, turning to face her directly. "You kept her story alive when everyone else had forgotten. The personal cost of that commitment hung unspoken between them. The years Sophia had devoted to a quest, others considered futile. The professional opportunities she had sacrificed to remain in Ravens Hollow, What had once seemed like career stagnation had transformed into her defining achievement. William Hargrove approached with the careful civility of a man who had recalculated his position based on changing circumstances. Mr. Caldwell, Dr. Reeves. He acknowledged them with a slight nod. A remarkable achievement. The Blackwood family would be proud to see their legacy honored so comprehensively. The carefully chosen words carried multiple implications. After their confrontation over Eleanor's journal, which had indeed been stolen by an associate of Hargrove's during the storm, legal proceedings had revealed the firm's long-standing efforts to suppress Eleanor's discoveries on behalf of clients implicated in the authentication of forgeries. Rather than pursuing criminal charges, Ethan and Sophia had negotiated a settlement that included financial restitution to the foundation and Hargrove's cooperation in accessing additional Blackwood family records. The pursuit of historical truth benefits everyone, Mr. Hargrove. Sophia replied diplomatically. Even those who initially preferred it remain hidden. As the evening continued, speeches from academic luminaries and local officials celebrated the exhibition and the newly established research center. When the formal presentations concluded and guests began to depart, Ethan and Sophia found themselves among the last remaining in the gallery. "Should we walk back to the mansion?" Sophia suggested. "It's a beautiful night." The path from the museum to Blackwood Manor had become a familiar route over the past months. What had once been a crumbling Victorian mansion was now well on its way to becoming a functional research facility, with the West Wing converted into modern laboratories and the East Wing restored to house visiting scholars. They walked in comfortable silence, the moonlight illuminating the tree-lined road. When they reached the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, now restored to their original grandeur, Ethan paused. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" "When I had just arrived and was completely overwhelmed by what I'd inherited." Sophia smiled. "At the memory. You looked like you wanted to get back in your truck and drive away as fast as possible." "I nearly did," he admitted. "If not for your enthusiasm about the house's history and your passion for Eleanor's work, I might have tried to sell the place to the first developer who made an offer." "And now?" Ethan looked up at the mansion, its windows glowing with warm light against the night sky. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." The transformation wasn't limited to the physical structure. The broke farmer who had arrived with nothing but a dog and desperate hope had become the executive director of a foundation, responsible for preserving a significant historical legacy and managing an international research program. As they continued up the driveway, Max bounded out to greet them, his enthusiasm undiminished by advancing age. Behind him came Miguel and several of the graduate students who had arrived early to assist with the research program's launch. "Dr. Reeves, Mr. Caldwell," one of the students called excitedly. "Professor Kimura's team just finished the preliminary analysis of the burial mask. The composition markers confirmed direct sourcing from the Yucatan quarries, exactly as Eleanor predicted." The news sparked immediate academic discussion, with Sophia leading the students back inside to review the findings. Ethan held back, watching her in her element, confident, passionate, and finally receiving the professional recognition she deserved. Later that night, after the students had returned to town and the mansion had quieted, Ethan found Sophia in Eleanor's study, which had been meticulously restored to its original condition. She sat at the desk where they had first discovered evidence of hidden compartments, reviewing notes for tomorrow's official opening. "Everyone's gone?" she asked, looking up as he entered. "Just us and Max," he confirmed, settling into a chair across from her. "He's currently guarding the kitchen, in case any more archaeological cookies appear." Sophia laughed, the sound warm in the quiet room. "Your dog has developed very specific academic interests." He's adaptable, Ethan said, from farm dog to archaeology mascot in less than a year. The statement applied equally to Ethan himself, who had adjusted to his new role with a combination of practical common sense and unexpected aptitude for institutional development. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone shifting to something more serious, "about what comes next." Sophia set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "For the foundation?" "For us," Ethan clarified. "Professionally and otherwise." Unspoken element of their relationship had evolved alongside their work together, from initial wariness to mutual respect, from collaboration to friendship, and gradually into something deeper that neither had fully acknowledged. "The Stanford position?" Sophia asked, referencing a prestigious opportunity she had been offered to join their anthropology faculty as a visiting professor. "Among other things," Ethan confirmed. "It's an incredible opportunity, Sophia. You deserve the recognition and the chance to bring Eleanor's work to a broader academic audience." "It would mean leaving Ravens Hollow," she said carefully. "At least part of the year." The implication hung between them. After years of academic isolation, Sophia now had options that would take her away from the small town and from the partnership they had built together. "I know," Ethan said, "which is why I think we should consider some structural changes to the Foundation's organization." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, placing it on the desk between them. "Including this." Sophia stared at the box, her academic composure momentarily fractured by genuine surprise. "Ethan." "I'm not very good at speeches," he said, the farmer's directness replacing any prepared romanticism. "But I know what matters to me now. This place, this work we're doing together, and most importantly, you." He opened the box, revealing not a conventional diamond ring, but an intricately crafted gold band set with a small piece of polished jade, reminiscent of the artifacts they had discovered together, but entirely modern in design. "I'm not asking you to choose between your academic career and staying here," he continued. "I'm suggesting we find a way to make both work, together, as partners in every sense." Sophia reached for the ring, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined the craftsmanship. "You had this made?" "A local artisan who specializes in historical techniques," Ethan confirmed, "with input from Miguel, who apparently has very strong opinions about jewelry design." A smile broke through her surprise. "Of course he does." She looked up from the ring to meet Ethan's gaze directly. "Are you sure about this? Your life has already changed so dramatically in such a short time." "That's exactly why I'm sure," he replied. "I lost everything I thought defined me. The farm, my family's legacy, my whole identity as a farmer. But in that loss, I found something I never expected, a new purpose, a community that values history as much as progress, and someone who sees the world in a way that makes me want to be part of her journey." Sophia rose from behind the desk, moving to stand before him. "You know, academic conferences can be deadly boring, and I get irritable when research isn't proceeding according to schedule. And I still wake up at dawn out of habit, talk to my dog like he's a person, and occasionally forget academic titles when introducing people." Ethan countered. "We'll adapt." She took his hand, placing the ring in his palm and extending her left hand. "Then yes, to partnership in all its forms." 1 year later, the grounds of Blackwood Manor were transformed for a different kind of occasion. White chairs dotted the restored garden, where Eleanor's favorite roses now bloomed alongside native plantings. An archway woven with local wildflowers stood at the center, framing the view of the mountains beyond. Ethan waited beneath the arch, Max sitting attentively at his feet with a small cushion bearing 2 rings secured to his collar. The gathered guests represented the diverse worlds that had converged in their story, Local residents of Ravens Hollow, academic colleagues from universities across the globe, and even a few farmers from Ethan's hometown invited to witness this new chapter in his life. As the string quartet began to play, Sophia appeared at the garden entrance, escorted by Miguel. Her dress, a simple design in vintage ivory, complemented the historical setting while reflecting her practical elegance. In her hands, she carried a bouquet that included sprigs from the rose bushes that had survived at Ethan's family farm, cuttings he had taken before leaving, now flourishing in their new home at Blackwood Manor. The symbolism wasn't lost on those who knew their story, elements of the past, transplanted and thriving in new soil, creating beauty that honored their origins while embracing a different future. Later, as twilight deepened and guests enjoyed the reception on the mansion's lawn, Ethan and Sophia slipped away for a quiet moment on the porch where they had shared so many conversations. "Happy?" Ethan asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the gathering. Sophia leaned against him, her academic reserve softened by genuine contentment. "Beyond anything I could have imagined when I first drove up that driveway to meet the strange farmer who'd bought Eleanor's mansion. I was thinking the same thing," Ethan admitted. "When I arrived here, I was just looking for shelter, somewhere to rebuild after losing everything. I never expected to find a purpose bigger than myself or someone who would make me grateful for the loss that led me here." In the library, behind glass in a specially designed display case, the golden statue that had first revealed Eleanor's secret now stood as a centerpiece of the mansion's permanent exhibition. Beside it, a photograph showed Ethan and Sophia on the day they had discovered it, their expressions capturing the moment when individual journeys had converged into a shared path neither could have anticipated. Beneath the photograph, a simple plaque bore Eleanor Blackwood's words, discovered in the final pages of her journal. "Some treasures are meant to be found at precisely the right moment, by exactly the right people. The past speaks to those prepared to listen, offering not just knowledge of what was, but wisdom for what might be." The broke farmer and the passionate curator had each found what they truly needed, not just in the priceless artifacts hidden beneath the floorboards, but in the shared values, mutual respect, and deepening love that had grown from their unexpected collaboration. Together, they had transformed loss into legacy, creating a future that honored the past while embracing possibilities neither had dared to imagine before fate and Eleanor Blackwood's hidden treasures brought them together at Blackwood Manor. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.